Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're going back in time,
Yeah.
way back to 1192 CE, to unpack one of the most pivotal battles in Indian history, the Second Battle of Tarain. Now, if you're thinking, another battle? Yeah, what's so special about this one? Trust me, you're in for a treat. This isn't just about armies clashing, it's about a clash of cultures, a story of ambition, cunning, and a turning point that shaped India for centuries. Hey, before we get started, if you enjoy this deep dive, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more fascinating historical explorations.
It's a battle that's often overshadowed by other major events, but its significance is undeniable. It really marks the beginning of a major power shift in the Indian subcontinent.
Okay, so to really get into the thick of it, we've got a stack of sources for this deep dive. Historical texts like the Tabakati Nasiri, encyclopedia entries that give us a broad overview, and even some blog posts that offer different perspectives on this clash of titans. But before we get into the battle itself, we need to meet our rivals right.
Absolutely. On one side, we have Mu'izz ad-Din Muhammad, better known as Muhammad of Ghor. He was the Sultan of the Ghurid Empire, a powerful force centered in what is now Afghanistan. He wasn't your typical image of a warlord, thundering down from the Central Asian steppes, though.
Oh, what makes him different?
Well, for starters, he was of Persian origin. This often gets overlooked, but it's a crucial detail. It challenges our assumptions about who the invaders were and adds another layer of complexity to the narrative.
It's always fascinating to see how those historical assumptions get flipped on their heads when you dig a little deeper. So this Persian sultan had his sights set on expanding his empire. Where did he run into trouble?
His westward expansion was blocked by the Khwarezmian Empire, another major power at the time, so naturally, he turned his attention eastward, towards the rich and fragmented lands of India. And that's where he encountered our second major player in this historical drama.
Prithviraj Chauhan, the Rajput king, right? The sources paint him as this almost legendary warrior king, a fierce defender of his territory.
Exactly. Prithviraj ruled over Ajmer and Delhi, and he led the Rajputs, a confederation of Hindu warrior clans who were renowned for their military prowess and their fierce defense of their lands. And here's where things get really interesting. He had already defeated Muhammad of Ghor at the First Battle of Tarain in 1191.
So the second battle is a rematch, fueled by a desire for revenge. Talk about a grudge match.
Precisely. The First Battle of Tarain was a humiliating defeat for Muhammad of Ghor. He was forced to retreat and regroup. But his ambition wasn't easily quelled. He spent a year strengthening his army, gathering intelligence, and meticulously planning his return to India. He even managed to capture the strategic fort of Bathinda, which served as a crucial stepping stone for his advance.
Wait, back up a second. Why was Bathinda so important?
Good question. Bathinda was a key fortress on the route from Ghor to Delhi. By capturing it, Muhammad of Ghor secured his supply lines and established a forward base from which he could launch his campaign. It was a brilliant strategic move. That gave him a significant advantage in the upcoming conflict.
So while Muhammad of Ghor is strategizing and preparing for round two, what's Prithviraj up to? Surely he's not just sitting back and relaxing after his victory.
Well, there's some debate among historians about whether Prithviraj might have been a tad complacent after his initial victory. Some sources suggest that he underestimated Muhammad of Ghor's determination to return with a vengeance.
That seems like a classic mistake. Underestimating your opponent's thirst for payback.
It certainly is. But regardless of Prithviraj's mindset, he did rally his Rajput allies and prepared for the inevitable confrontation. Now, this is where we get into some of those fascinating historical discrepancies. Some sources claim that the armies involved were absolutely massive, numbering in the hundreds of thousands.
Beyond hundreds of thousands, even for a major battle. That seems a bit over the top, doesn't it?
Most modern historians agree with you. Those inflated figures likely served a specific purpose. Chroniclers, especially those writing for the winning side, often exaggerated the size of the enemy's forces to make the victories seem even more glorious. It's a reminder that we always have to consider the source's perspective when analyzing historical accounts.
Okay, that makes sense. It's like those epic movie battles where the heroes are always outnumbered 10-1. Adds to the drama. So we've got our two rivals, both with their armies assembled. The tension is building. What happens next? This is where the Second Battle of Tarain truly kicks off, right?
This is where it gets really interesting. Muhammad of Ghor, ever the cunning strategist, decided to employ a tactic that was as clever as it was deceptive. He feigned a desire for a truce with Prithviraj.
A truce. So he's trying to lull Prithviraj into a false sense of security. Classic military strategy.
Exactly. Several Persian sources, like the Jami' ul-Hikayat and Taj al-Masir, suggests that Muhammad Ghori intentionally misled Prithviraj, leading him to believe that negotiations were underway, while secretly planning a surprise attack.
It makes you wonder how often this kind of deception was used in warfare throughout history. It's almost like a psychological game as much as a physical one. So what happened? Did Prithviraj fall for it?
Unfortunately for Prithviraj, it seems that he did. Muhammad Ghori, learning from his previous defeat, decided that he wouldn't make the mistake of meeting the Rajputs head-on. In a traditional daytime battle, he knew the Rajputs were renowned for their disciplined warfare, especially their cavalry charges. So he had to come up with a plan to disrupt their tactics and exploit their weaknesses.
Okay, so if he wasn't going for a direct attack, what was his strategy? What was his cunning plan?
He decided to leverage the speed and agility of his own cavalry, but with a twist. He split his army into 5 units. 4 of these units were composed of light cavalry, armed with bows, classic horse archers.
Hit-and-run tactics.
Exactly. They were ordered to harass the Rajput flanks and rear, and then feign retreat if the Rajputs pursued.
To draw them out and exhaust them. I can see where this is going.
You're catching on quickly. The sources we have, such as Minhaji Siraj's Tabakat-in-Nasiri, describe how this all played out in the pre-dawn hours, catching the Rajput army completely by surprise.
Ouch. A pre-dawn attack. Imagine being woken up by a rain of arrows. That must have been devastating.
I don't even want to imagine. The sources paint a pretty chaotic picture, with the Rajputs scrambling to respond to this unexpected attack. And remember, the Rajputs were primarily a cavalry force themselves, accustomed to fighting in formation during the day. They were not prepared for these kinds of night skirmishes or hit-and-run tactics.
It sounds like a complete mismatch in terms of fighting styles, not just a surprise attack. So we've got the Ghurids launching this harassing attack. The Rajputs are caught off guard and trying to regroup. What does Muhammad Ghori do next? Does he just keep peppering them with arrows?
He's got one more trick up his sleeve. He unleashes his trump card. A heavy cavalry charge. Remember that 5th unit I mentioned? That was composed of his most elite, heavily armored cavalrymen. He held them back until the Rajputs were sufficiently weakened and demoralized by the horse archers. And then,
bam. The hammer blow that breaks the Rajput line.
I got it. The Tabakat-in-Nasiri describes the Ghurids charging into the exhausted and disorganized Rajput forces, causing complete chaos and panic. And that, unfortunately for Prithviraj Chauhan, decided the fate of the battle. A combination of cunning, strategic brilliance, and brute force won the day for Muhammad Ghori.
What a story. But what happened to Prithviraj after this crushing defeat? And what were the larger consequences of this battle for both India and Muhammad Ghori's ambitions? That's a story for part 2 of our deep dive. Stay tuned, folks.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the Second Battle of Tarain, where we left off with Muhammad Ghori's decisive victory. But this story doesn't end there.
It never does it? Victories always have consequences. In this case, I'm particularly curious about what became of Prithviraj Chauhan after his defeat.
That's where things get a bit murky. There are conflicting accounts from various historical sources about Prithviraj's ultimate fate, and those conflicting narratives actually tell us a lot about how history is recorded and interpreted.
Ooh, a historical mystery. Give me all the versions. I love trying to piece together the puzzle.
Some sources, like Minhaji Siraj's Tabakat-in-Nasiri, which we mentioned earlier, state that Prithviraj was captured and then dispatched to hell. This suggests he was executed relatively soon after the battle.
Brutal, but efficient. I can see why a conqueror might want to eliminate a powerful rival quickly to avoid any future uprisings.
Exactly. But other sources, including Kajul Masir and Tariki Frishta, offer a more elaborate and dramatic version of events. They claim Prithviraj was taken back to Ajmer, his own capital, where Muhammad Ghori planned to reinstate him as a vassal ruler.
So a bit of a keep your enemies closer strategy. I can see the logic in that, too.
Yeah.
Keep a watchful eye on a potentially rebellious figure.
Precisely. But according to these sources, Prithviraj, ever the proud warrior king, couldn't stomach the thought of being a puppet ruler. He's said to have plotted a rebellion against Muhammad Ghori, which ultimately led to his execution.
Wow, what a defiant end. Though I have to admit, I'm a little suspicious of that version of events. It feels a bit too convenient, doesn't it? Like it was crafted to make Muhammad Ghori seem more merciful initially, and then justified in his later actions.
You've hit on a key point here about historical narratives. Who's writing the history and what are their motivations? It always shapes the story. Whether Prithviraj was executed quickly or after a failed rebellion. The Second Battle of Tarain marked a turning point in Indian history. It's impossible to overstate the significance of this event.
Because it opened the door for the establishment of the Delhi Sultanate, right?
Yeah.
The first major Muslim kingdom in northern India.
Exactly. The Delhi Sultanate would rule for centuries, shaping the political, cultural, and even religious landscape of the subcontinent. This wasn't just another regime change, it was a seismic shift in the balance of power and the cultural fabric of India.
It's fascinating how one battle can have such far-reaching repercussions. We often think of history as a series of isolated events, but they're all interconnected, aren't they? Like dominoes falling one after another.
Precisely. And the Ghurids didn't just stop with Prithviraj's kingdom, they continued their eastward expansion, capturing Delhi, and then pushing further into the Gangetic Plains. By 1206, they'd reached Bengal, a testament to their military prowess and ambition.
So for Muhammad Ghori, the Second Battle of Tarain was just the beginning. It was the key that unlocked a whole new realm of conquests. He was like a chess master, thinking several moves ahead.
That's a great analogy, but it's important to note that Muhammad Ghori wasn't personally involved in all those later campaigns. He relied heavily on his skilled generals, most notably Qutb din Aibak, who would later become the first Sultan of Delhi.
Delegation, the hallmark any successful conqueror. But it's interesting, isn't it, that for such a pivotal battle, there are still so many unanswered questions and lingering controversies. It makes you realize that history is not always a neat and tidy narrative.
That's the beauty of it, isn't it? It keeps us guessing, keeps us digging for more clues. We have these tantalizing glimpses from the sources, but often we're left piecing together fragments of information and interpreting them through different lenses.
For example, we talked about the exaggerated figures for the size of the armies, but there's also debate about the specific tactics employed and even the precise location of the battlefield itself.
Absolutely. Pinpointing the exact location of a battle fought over 800 years ago can be incredibly challenging. And when it comes to tactics, well, as we've seen, those historical accounts can be embellished or influenced by various agendas.
It's like trying to solve a historical crime scene, sifting through evidence and trying to reconstruct what actually happened.
And sometimes the evidence leads to more questions than answers. Take the conflicting accounts of Prithviraj's fate. Was he a defiant hero who died fighting for his kingdom? Or a shrewd ruler who tried to play the game of politics and lost? The truth likely lies somewhere in between.
It reminds us that historical figures were real people with complex motivations and personalities, not just names in a textbook. They made choices, some brilliant, some disastrous, and those choices shaped the course of history. And we're still grappling with the consequences of those choices today.
Well said. And it's those complexities, those unanswered questions, that make history so fascinating to explore. It's not about memorizing dates and battles. It's about trying to understand the past, the people who lived through it, and how their actions continue to shape our present.
Absolutely. And as we've seen with the Second Battle of Tarain, that understanding is constantly evolving as we uncover new evidence, consider different perspectives, and challenge long-held assumptions.
And that brings us to another crucial aspect of this battle's legacy, one that goes beyond the immediate political and military upheaval, its impact on the social, cultural, and religious landscape of India.
That's a whole other layer of the story, isn't it? How did the Second Battle of Tarain reshape the very fabric of Indian society? Let's dive into those fascinating and complex questions. In the final part of our deep dive, welcome back to the deep dive,
where we're exploring the lasting impact of the Second Battle of Tarain.
As we've seen, this wasn't just a battle for territory. It was a clash of cultures that sent shockwaves through Indian society and set in motion a series of changes that would reverberate for centuries.
Absolutely. It was a catalyst for a profound transformation that reshaped India's political, social, and cultural landscape.
So let's unpack those shifts. Where do we even begin?
Well, the most immediate and obvious change was the establishment of Muslim rule in northern India. With the rise of the Delhi Sultanate, this new ruling class brought with it a blend of Persian, Turkish, and Afghan influences, introducing a new administrative structure and ways of governing.
So a whole new power dynamic was at play, which I imagine led to some tension.
It was definitely a complex and often turbulent period. The historical sources paint a mixed picture. With instances of both conflict and cooperation, there were undoubtedly tensions between the newly established Muslim rulers and the existing Hindu population. After all, the Second Battle of Tarain represented a significant loss of power for many Hindu rulers.
It's easy to imagine resentment and resistance from those who were displaced or marginalized.
Of course. But it's crucial to remember that history is rarely a simple black and white narrative. There were also examples of cooperation and cultural exchange. Many Hindus continued to serve in government roles, and the Ghurids themselves were pragmatic rulers. They adapted to the existing Indian administrative systems and drew upon the expertise of local officials.
So it wasn't a complete cultural or political overhaul. It was more of a blending of different systems and traditions.
Yeah, precisely. Over time, a kind of syncretism emerged, with elements of both Hindu and Islamic cultures intertwining. This fusion can be seen in various aspects of Indian society, from art and architecture to language and even religious practices.
That's fascinating. It reminds us that historical change is rarely a sudden or complete break. It's more of a gradual process, with elements of the past lingering and blending with the new.
Exactly. And speaking of blending, one of the interesting consequences of this cultural exchange was the introduction of new agricultural techniques and crops from Central Asia. The Ghurids brought with them innovative irrigation methods and new varieties of fruits and vegetables, which enriched India's agricultural practices.
So even amidst the turmoil of conquest, there were these unexpected benefits. These exchanges often happen in the shadows of major historical events, don't they?
They do, and it's a reminder that history is full of surprises. It's not always about war and destruction. Sometimes it's about the subtle ways in which cultures interact and adapt, even in the face of conflict.
Did this exchange of knowledge go both ways? Did anything from India make its way back to Central Asia?
Absolutely. Indian textiles, spices, and craftsmanship were highly sought after in Central Asia. The Silk Road and other trade routes flourished, despite the political shifts, facilitating a vibrant exchange of goods and ideas.
It's amazing how these networks of trade and cultural exchange can persist even in times of conflict. It speaks to the enduring human desire to connect and share with others.
Indeed. And speaking of sharing, the arrival of Islam in India also introduced new artistic, architectural, and literary traditions. Think about the magnificent mosques and tombs built during the Delhi Sultanate era. They're not just impressive structures. They represent a fusion of Persian Islamic and Indian architectural styles.
They're truly architectural marvels. You can see the blending of different influences and aesthetics.
Exactly. And this blending wasn't limited to architecture. The Persian language, which the Ghurids used in their administration, had a lasting impact on the development of Hindi and Urdu, the languages that would come to be spoken by millions in northern India.
It's incredible to think that we can still see the legacy of this battle in the languages spoken today. It's a testament to how deeply historical events can shape the present.
It really is. And it's not just about tangible things, like buildings and language. The Second Battle of Tarain also had a profound impact on religious beliefs and practices in India.
In what way?
The presence of Islam led to new forms of religious dialogue and interaction. Some of these interactions were undoubtedly marked by conflict, but they also led to periods of relative tolerance and the emergence of new religious ideas and practices. For example, new Sufi orders gained prominence, emphasizing mystical experiences and a more inclusive approach to faith.
So out of this clash of empires and cultures, a new spiritual landscape emerged, one that continues to shape India to this day.
Exactly. It's a reminder that history is a dynamic process. It's not just about dates and battles. It's about the enduring legacies those events leave behind, shaping our beliefs, our cultures, and our very identities.
Well said. So for all of you listening out there, what do you think is the most enduring legacy of the Second Battle of Tarain? How has it shaped the India we know today? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and let's continue the conversation.
And in the meantime, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into the fascinating world of history.
Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more explorations of history, science, culture, and everything in between. We'll see you next time.